those curbs, starting even before the current administration, right? Cutting off companies like Huawei from chips.
Exactly. And this is where, the data shows things getting really interesting. It wasn't just a roadblock for China, it actually forced a reaction, a big one. The notes highlight China seeing this huge risk being cut off from a supply chain largely controlled by the West. So what do? They started pouring incredible amounts of capital and maybe even more importantly, human resources into building their own semiconductor capability from the ground up. Design, fabs, everything. The note suggests this wasn't just about playing catch-up. It was framed as, well, almost survival, ensuring they weren't vulnerable in the future.
Okay, so that was China's reaction. But what are the flip side? What do the notes say about the impact of that U.S. strategy back on the U.S. itself? Any surprises there?
Well, yeah, this is one of the fascinating takeaways from the data. These sanctions, they might actually be, let's say, problematic for the U.S. in the long run. By blocking access to the Chinese market, and the notes remind us, that's a huge market, like 30–40%, maybe more, and still growing. You're effectively hobbling key American tech companies.
You mean like NVIDIA?
NVIDIA, Synopsys, Cadence, yeah. Even European companies like ASML, they rely on that global market, including China, for revenue. Revenue that fuels R&D for the next generation. So cutting that off, it has consequences.
That makes sense, the market access part.
Yeah.
But you mentioned another unintended consequence, something about solving a problem for China. How does that work?
Right. This is a really critical point in the notes. Before the sanctions, Chinese companies like, say, SMIC, their big chip manufacturer, they were happy to use the best international suppliers. Why wouldn't they?
Made business sense.
Exactly. But the sanctions made that route risky. Too risky. So what happened? The notes suggest it basically forced alignment within China. Now you have SMIC, Huawei, smaller startups, the government, all suddenly pulling in the same direction, working, hand in glove. Their goal, rebuild the entire domestic supply chain. Materials, tools, lithography, inspection equipment, even the design software. It created this coherent ecosystem, all marching together because of the external threat outlined in these notes.
Wow. Okay, so it kind of forced their hand, unified their efforts. What about the assumptions behind the U.S. strategy initially? Notes touch on that, right?
They do. The data points to an underlying assumption, perhaps early on, that China was mainly good at copying, that they were technologically far behind, and could essentially be crippled, like maybe Iran or a smaller state.
And is that holding up, according to this data?
Well, the data strongly suggests no. Not really. China's different. The scale is just immense. And crucially, it's the human capital. The notes highlight the significant flow of talent engineers, scientists, especially from places like Taiwan and South Korea. Many experienced engineers at CIMIC reportedly came from TSMC or UMC. They bring that deep practical knowledge.
That tacit knowledge you can't just read in a book.
Exactly that. And the notes even mention influential figures like Eric Schmidt, who apparently argued for crippling China initially, but has since reportedly changed his tune, acknowledging they're catching up extremely fast. So the idea that you can just stop them, it's looking less and less likely.
Okay, let's shift gears a little to AI. The notes cover this too. How does China stack up in the AI race based on this information?
It seems the gap between, say, the top U.S. AI labs and China's best efforts is, well, pretty small. 6 months to a year, something like that. There was this DeepSeek moment mentioned in the notes where a Chinese model basically reached the frontier performance-wise.
And that wasn't just a one-off.
Apparently not. The notes mention other big players, Alibaba, Baidu, ByteDance. They all have models that are right up there, competitive with the best from the U.S.
So why should, someone building AI applications care about this? Does China having competitive models give them some kind of edge, the notes point out?
Yeah, this is where it gets really practical and interesting. The notes emphasize that a lot of the best open source models right now are coming out of China. DeepSeek is the example given.
Open source, meaning anyone can use them.
Basically, yes. Software companies, developers, they can get the actual model weights, the core AI, and they can tweak it, fine-tune it for their specific needs. And here's the key thing highlighted in the notes. They can run it in their customer's own environment. Think about a bank, right? They don't want their sensitive data going back to OpenAI or Google.
Data privacy.
Exactly. Running these open source models locally guarantees that privacy. The notes stress how valuable this is for businesses. It's driving real market traction for these models.
Got it. Okay, back to the hardware, the chips. The notes talk about NVIDIA wanting global share, obviously, but facing a serious challenger within China.
Right. NVIDIA is definitely concerned about potentially losing the China market, according to the notes. And while they're ahead right now, Blackwell looks incredibly powerful. The notes point to Huawei and their Ascend 910C chip.
Which isn't quite as powerful individually.
Perhaps not one-to-one, but Huawei's playing a different game, leveraging their strength in networking. The notes describe this cloud matrix cluster they've built. What's fascinating, based on the data, is how they're connecting potentially hundreds of these Ascend chips using advanced optical networking, fiber.
Faster connections between chips.
Potentially faster data exchange than, say, NVIDIA's current NVLink architecture, according to the notes. It's described as another potential DeepSeek moment, but in hardware architecture this time. A leapfrog. The implication: if Chinese companies are cut off from NVIDIA, they might shift their software, maybe using frameworks like CNN instead of CUDA, onto this Huawei cluster.
And still train cutting-edge models.
Potentially, yes. That would significantly boost their independent compute power and, over time, could eat into NVIDIA's revenue, which impacts their future R&D. It's a very dynamic situation, the notes describe.
All this AI and chip stuff takes a ton of energy. Do the notes say anything about who has the edge in the power game? Because that seems crucial.
It's a really important point, and yes, the notes dig into it, often overlooked. The argument presented is, if AI becomes super cheap and widespread, its cost might ultimately boil down to the cost of electricity.
That makes sense.
So who can build data centers and expand their electricity grid the fastest and cheapest? Here, the data highlights a huge advantage for China. While U.S. grid capacity growth has been, well, almost flat for decades, China's has exploded. The notes show graphs. It's dramatic. They've surpassed the U.S. total output already, and their growth trajectory is much steeper.
How are they doing that?
Massive rollouts of nuclear and solar, according to the notes. They even draw an analogy to energy-hungry industries like aluminum production, where China dominates. The suggestion is they could potentially power global AI just by redirecting existing capacity. And you hear reports mentioned in the notes about figures like Sam Altman struggling to get power plants approved quickly in the U.S. It underscores the difference in execution speed on energy infrastructure.
Okay, another fundamental concept. Moore's Law. Chips getting smaller, faster, cheaper. Is that still the main story, according to these notes?
What's interesting here is the nuance the notes bring out. Traditional Moore's Law just shrinking the size of transistors. The feature size is slowing down. It's getting much harder, much more expensive.
So those numbers like 2 nanometer, they aren't the whole picture.
They're becoming more like marketing terms than precise physical measurements. The real gains in AI chips now, according to this data, come more from optimizing the architecture of the chip. How the chip is designed internally, how data moves, bandwidth, how it handles memory specifically tailored for the math involved in AI models, like transformers.
So it's less about just cramming more stuff in, more of a smarter design for the specific task.
Exactly. Making the chip better at doing that one specific thing really well. It's a shift the notes say isn't always well understood outside the semiconductor industry itself.
We hear a lot about bringing chip manufacturing back to the U.S. TSMC building factories in Arizona, for instance. How realistic is that whole effort based on what's in these notes?
The notes are pretty clear. This is a very long-term game. Think a decade, maybe more. It's not just about building the factories.
Right. You mentioned the tacit knowledge earlier.
Exactly. That practical, hands-on expertise, how to calibrate the incredibly complex machines, how to solve yield problems on the factory floor day after day. That's not in textbooks. And the notes point out where that knowledge largely resides and is currently flowing from Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, often towards China. Replicating that deep pool of experience in the U.S. is described as a heavy lift.
So not something that happens overnight just because of some new policies or tariffs?
Definitely not, according to this data. It requires sustained, patient effort in building up that human expertise base.
Which brings us back to people. Given how vital that human capital is, some U.S. policies about restricting talent flow, they seem kind of counterintuitive based on these notes.
Yeah, this raises a really important question discussed in the notes. Is banning, say, Chinese graduate students or making it harder for top technical talent to come to or stay in the U.S.? Is that a mistake? It's a huge mistake. The U.S. has historically thrived on attracting the best minds from around the world, a brain drain towards the U.S. The notes even quote a top professor, also linked to TSMC, saying the leading-edge research in his specific field is now actually being done in China.
Wow.
So cutting off that flow of students and researchers, it potentially prevents the U.S. from accessing some of the very best global talent, which could ultimately harm its own competitiveness. That's the concern raised in these notes.
Okay, so for someone trying to follow this, trying to gauge progress, what should they actually watch for? Are there specific indicators mentioned in the notes?
The notes flag a couple of key technical milestones. One is whether China can domestically produce its own EUV light source. That's the really complex heart of the machines needed for the most advanced chips.
The ones ASML currently dominates.
Exactly. The timeline is unclear, but the notes hint that prototypes might be in testing. If China achieves domestic EUV production capability, that's a major step towards self-sufficiency and leading-edge manufacturing. The other thing is adoption of hardware like the Huawei Cloud Matrix cluster we talked about. If Chinese companies successfully move their big AI training jobs onto that platform,
Shows they have a powerful domestic alternative to NVIDIA.
precisely, it signals real compute independence. And more broadly, the notes suggest watching for these sort of deep-seek moments across different tech areas. China's huge pool of engineers means they're constantly pushing boundaries. The notes cite CATL's advances in sodium batteries as another example of them leapfrogging in a different tech vertical.
It seems like there are different schools of thought, especially in the U.S., about the right strategy here. Can you unpack those based on the notes?
Yeah, the notes outline sort of two main camps regarding AI strategy in the U.S. One view seems to believe in a really fast takeoff towards artificial general intelligence, maybe just a few years away.
The AGI believers.
Right. And their strategy, as described in the notes, logically follows. Suppress China hard right now. Buy time for the U.S. to hit that AGI flywheel first, where AI starts improving itself exponentially. This view actually influenced things like the NVIDIA bans.
Okay, what's the alternative view presented?
The other perspective, which the notes present as maybe more prudent or aligned with a longer timescale, is that the U.S. needs to focus on strengthening itself fundamentally. This means serious reindustrialization, real investment in manufacturing, not just tariffs, and crucially, producing more scientists, engineers, technologists at home.
So less about stopping the opponent, more about running faster yourself.
Exactly. The notes argue there are no shortcuts. The U.S. needs to make foundational investments to compete long-term across many technologies, not just bet everything on a short-term AI race. And for China, the notes suggest their strength is that human capital. The strategy should be to leverage it, let markets work, allow that intense provincially backed competition to drive innovation, while maybe avoiding too much stifling central control.
Stepping back from the tech specifics for a moment,
Country with a fifth of the world's population that was, relatively down for a century or so, coming back incredibly strongly. And this huge geopolitical shift is happening at the exact same time as these unbelievable breakthroughs in AI and other technologies. The notes basically say it feels like living in a sci-fi novel.
it does feel a bit like that
Yeah.
sometimes.
It's exciting, for sure, but also complex. The world, according to these notes, is going to look radically different in just 10 or 20 years because of these combined forces. Absolutely. And what's really clear from this material is that nothing is guaranteed. The outcomes are far from certain for either side. Actions have reactions, sometimes unexpected ones.
We saw how sanctions, according to these notes, might have inadvertently helped China unify its efforts, how open-source AI models are creating new dynamics, how basic things like energy are becoming central.
The interconnectedness is key.
If Moore's law, the traditional shrinking of chips, is slowing down, and the future of AI performance becomes more about clever architecture and, maybe critically, the cost of energy, does China's edge highlighted in the notes in building out energy infrastructure rapidly, combined with their sheer volume of technical talent, give them a kind of fundamental long-term advantage? Maybe one that short-term chip restrictions can't fully counteract. Something to think about.